This hybrid event will give us a chance to have a wonderful discussion with these three extremely distinguished women who are on the stage with me today. And let me introduce them to you. So to my left is Jimena Leiva. She's the Director of Global Initiatives and Head of Peace, Climate, and Sustainable Development at the International Peace Institute. From 2009 to 2015, Jimena was at the Permanent Mission of Guatemala to the UN in New York, where she last served as counselor. She was Guatemala's lead negotiator for the Paris Agreement on climate change and currently serves as an advisor to the Republic of Maldives on climate issues. To her left is Stacey Ann Robinson, who is the 2022-2023 Lightning Scholar at Perry Worldhouse and an assistant professor of environmental studies at Colby College. Stacey Ann researches the human, social, and policy dimensions of climate change adaptation in small island developing states, with a special focus on climate justice and adaptation finance, and also, of course, our topic of today, loss and damage. And to her left is Zinta Summers, who's a humanitarian affairs officer with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Zinta is a specialist in risk management and climate change adaptation, working to reduce vulnerability to climate shocks by strengthening early warning and anticipatory action systems. Zinta has also previously served in many other roles in the UN, including the UN Environment Program and in the Secretary General's office. So please welcome all of our distinguished guests, and welcome to all of you. So today we're going to talk about COP27, and this is the UN Climate Summit, and we're going to talk about some of the most important outcomes of that meeting. So I wanted to, I'm going to ask a couple of short questions to our guests today, and then we'll of course open everything up for discussion. So I wanted to start with Jimena and ask you, what is COP? What is the Conference of the Parties?
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And I'm delighted to be here with you and also with Said here upstairs. And I remember the first time I met Said and we gave him our first briefing, I told him Richard Kingsley, who was Christiana Figueres' right hand, would always used to say, COP is both a process and a conference. And since Paris, both of those things have grown in immense ways. So before COP was just a small meeting, a small UN meeting. You know, a few thousand people would go. It was mainly just a process. But since Paris, the process has been accompanied by a growing kind of Davos-style conference where you see a massive media space, where you see the private sector also engaging, and you see a much more diverse group of actors coalescing on climate. And the process has equally grown to include not only ministries of environment, but also foreign affairs, of trade, of agriculture. So both parts of them have exponentially grown through the years, and we can see that the biodiversity COP is going in a similar path, but just a few years in delay.
Okay, great. And so COP27, as you said, it's the Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is the 27th year just passed. And this was a COP, it was in Egypt. It was a tense COP to say the least, but the kind of the highlight of the event was this decision on loss and damage financing. And I want to ask you, Stacey Ann, if you could just tell us a little bit about what is loss and damage, and what is loss and damage financing?
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. I had the privilege of being part of UPenn's delegation to COP27. So again, a great opportunity to get my hands and feet a bit dirty. So as Jimena said, you know, COP is essentially a process and also a conference. So when it comes to loss and damage, it has become part of this process of the climate negotiations. And because it is a conference, we gather together to discuss the substantive issues related to loss and damage. We also discuss the future of loss and damage. Loss and damage in the context of the UNFCCC it's interesting. I think, you know, like the conference itself, it has evolved over the years. And like many of the issues that are negotiated year after year, there is no universally agreed definition of loss and damage. So many things similarly to climate finance. So I think that's one of the first things that I want to share. Within that, I always emphasize that it has two components. It's the loss component and the damage component. And I think each of them offers its own sense of flexibility and also sense of complexity. So when we think of loss, we're thinking of those things that we lose permanently and can't get back. So when it comes to climate associated loss, we're probably thinking about things like the loss of culture, cultural heritage, language, loss of life, etc. But when we think of damage, we're thinking of those things that we can rebuild. So there might be damage to infrastructure that is, climate related. Now, Michael will tell you that, maybe that in and of itself is a little bit complex. Maybe that distinction isn't so clear, but I think that's the foundation that we will build on for a continued engagement in this process as we try to refine our understandings of these terms.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Why is COP talking about loss and damage and not just like our low carbon future? Don't mean to set you up or anything.
Well, thank you, Michael. Well, there are many climate impacts. And one of the things that I always go back to is that Framework Convention on Climate Change, the 1992 convention that lays the foundation for all the negotiations. And that's especially true from my perspective. So I would argue that in the Framework Convention, it was largely focused on mitigation. Throughout the years, we've added a focus on adaptation, but from my perspective, and others will agree, that has played almost second fiddle to mitigation. And now we're in this new era of loss and damage, which, in all intents and purposes can be seen as that third pillar of the UNFCCC, but it's still trailing adaptation and it's still trailing mitigation. So it's this idea that these are the impacts over and above what we can adapt to. And that's why we're discussing loss and damage.
And I can see him and wants to jump in. Go for it.
Just in addition to what Stacy said, we both work for the Minister of the Maldives, Minister Shauna, and she used, when asked this question, she said, well, the world has failed on mitigation, the world has failed on adaptation. Now we're in the last threshold, which is the loss and damage one.
So this actually sets up very nicely the next question. I was hoping that could ask Zinta. So Stacy and Jimena and I are primarily working on policy. And although you have done that in the past, right now you actually are working on the ground and actually seeing what loss and damage looks like in many different countries that you've worked in. Can you describe some of what it actually looks like on the ground and some of the actual responses that are necessary to save people, save infrastructure, preserve health, things like that?
Sure. And thank you very much for the question. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think we all know what some of the losses and damages look like. You've seen images from the floods in Pakistan this year, from hurricanes and cyclones in the past. From my own experience, I'll just highlight that loss and damage means, for example, in South Sudan, a country that's been struggling with conflict for many years, there's an IDP camp, so a camp for internally displaced people in Bentu, and then the north of the country, that now has 100,000 people entirely surrounded by floodwater. And so that means damages to roads, but more critically, potentially the loss of life if a dirt dike breaches due to extreme rainfall. That's a very complicated situation because you have conflict and you have now water and displaced people and no way to get them out because infrastructure has been washed out. So for humanitarians, it creates huge challenges. In another context, we have losses and damages right now in the Horn of Africa, in Somalia, for example, where lack of rainfall there has prevented people from planting seeds or pastoralists from feeding their cattle and their camels, and now we're facing famine. So there again, it's a grave impact and loss of life. But you also mentioned that it's climate-related losses and damages occur to cultural services and to ecosystem services. And I'll give you two examples of that from my previous work with the UN Environment Program. We did a research project on how climate change is impacting ecosystem services. So you might have the ability, again, in Kenya and northern Turkana, people use river water often for their own household needs, but now you have dry riverbeds. So you have ecosystem services that are impacted by climate-related losses. And finally, culturally, for example, my own family, we're Latvian, and in Latvia, here is a northern country in Europe. And here, I know we're all suffering from the lack of snow. And there are, for example, we have traditional folk songs about knitting socks for wolves so their feet are warm running through the snow. We can't say that anymore because potentially there won't be any snow. And so what happens to our folk songs, our traditions, or how do we teach that to future generations? So I think losses and damages affect all of us in different ways. And those are some examples.
Thank you so much. This is, I hope, really now helping us think into this topic, and so seeing how it's very easy to sort of focus on a hurricane, but then to think about, what do people in an internally displacement camp look like when they're surrounded by river water? How are we thinking about cultural losses, which gets in this context sometimes called non-economic losses? So I want to now turn a little bit back to COP itself and maybe ask Jimena. Actually, no, I'm going to start with Stacy actually and ask you what's been called for by the Alliance of Small Island States in particular has led the issue of loss and damage for many years. What have they been calling for? Can you walk us through the history just a little bit?
I would actually go on a limb and say that Small Island Developing States, or SIDS for short, have really been carrying global climate policy on their backs for a very long time. And a great example here is the issue of loss and damage, because one of the things that I always try to explain is that this discussion actually predates the UNFCCC, which was agreed in 1992. So I always go back to the 1991 proposal that was developed by Vanuatu on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States back in 1991, when they're actually starting the negotiations for the text of the 1992 agreement. And that proposal really called for an insurance mechanism to deal with, at the time, it wasn't called loss and damage, but it's similar to the discussions that we're having now, loss and damage from sea level rise. So even before we had the text of the convention, AOSIS, they had this messaging out there in the future. And in some instances, even right now, then back in 1991, we are going to have or experience these impacts that are going to cause us immeasurable loss and damage. And we need financing to deal with that. But at the time, the proposal on the table was an insurance mechanism. So from 1991, before the 1992 convention, there was this idea that we're going to need monies to deal with loss and damage from, well, global warming, sea level rise, and now the conversation has evolved into climate change. But from my perspective, there has been quite a bit of obstruction, mostly from the countries in the global north, to this idea of mobilizing funds to deal with loss and damage. And because of that, for a significant number of years, there was not much progress on this issue on loss and damage. And this is why scholars have somehow concluded that this idea of loss and damage wasn't formally recognized in the UNFCCC system until the COP in 2007 at Bali, where you first see this expression in the UNFCCC text. So we trucked along, we got the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, at COP19 in 2013, where we're starting to recognize, and lots of the language deals with recognizing and averting and minimizing loss and damage. But then bring us forward to COP27, which was last year, when we're actually seeing the establishment of financial arrangements, and within that, a fund to deal with loss and damage. So from my perspective, the issue of finance has been there from the beginning, even before the UNFCCC, got lots of obstruction throughout this process and the conference. But here we are on the threshold of something great, where we have funding arrangements, but no money.
Well, that is a perfect segue to my question for Jimena, which you were centrally involved in the negotiation around these issues of funding arrangements for loss and damage. And I see on your lap is a copy of the decision text. If anyone wants to see what it looks like, you could pop up afterwards and see what it is that we do, why we go blind slowly. Could you tell us a little bit about this decision on funding arrangements, including a fund?
Thank you. And I agree, it was the perfect segue. Thank you. And Cinta, thank you so much also for bringing the cultural aspects of loss and damage, because it's something that is really hard to be tangible about what's lost in terms of song and folklore and food, you know, all the non-tangible effects of loss and damage. But why are we talking loss and damage? I mean, it sounds so dreary, but really without the loss and damage decision, the Sharm el-Sheikh COP would have been a very, very difficult COP. Like this was the single success at COP. Aside from the youth program and some other low-hanging fruit, this was a major success at COP. And so why was it such a major success? And I think it builds on what Stacy said. This has been, the issue of loss and damage has been a call by SIDS for a very long time. And this was, the timing was just ripe for it. You know, like mitigation has, the mitigation work program or the mitigation work is, a rule book was done in Glasgow, more or less, you know. So the negotiators had to focus on something, because when I teach negotiations, I always tell that negotiators are wordsmiths. You know, we focus on words. That's what we do. We visualize the future and then we put it on paper. And so this decision is so visionary because for the very first time, we're plugging the UNFCCC with much larger flows of money. So what we really envisioned for loss and damage was there's not enough money to fund loss and damage at scale through bilateral means. You know, as Cinta mentioned, the floods in Pakistan, there's not enough money in the humanitarian space to really cover the costs of all of that human life, infrastructure, and the multiple arrays. So what do we need to do? And what does the decision call on? It calls on Kristalina from the IFIs. It calls on Malpass from the World Bank. It calls on the private sector. It calls on new sources of finance to fund loss and damage at scale. That means we have to think of windfall taxes on how to, the price of oil. We need to think of air travel. We need to think on a variety of sources that will give us the money to really provide support, for example, for the Maldives that are looking their reefs disappear slowly. Issues that will have a very direct impact in our generation and all future generations. And this is the beginning of it.
It maybe, it was so beautiful the way you put it that I hate to ask you for like some nitty gritty details, but could you give us some nitty gritty details? Like what, I mean, what does it actually mean to do that? Like what does this text actually call for?
So the text, first of all, which is a huge thing because everyone thought the US and developed countries would never agree to agree on establishing new funding arrangements for loss and damage, even though it doesn't say so that bluntly.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah.
And why you and Stacey have both mentioned that the US and the developed world has generally been opposed to this. Could you say why? And then why this
in
is
a
great?
way, there's this, the loss and damage debate in some respects is connected to compensation and liability, right? And the US has never liked being pointed fingers at them in terms of, oh, you were the cause that we're suffering loss and damage. So Article 8 of the Paris Agreement is very specific on separating compensation and liability. That's Article 8 is loss and damage in the Paris Agreement. So basically in 2015, we were able to separate loss and damage from compensation and liability. So this decision text and the footnote, always read the footnotes if you want to be in this business. The footnote clearly differentiates that anything on this decision on loss and damage does not include compensation and liability, which was the major problem for the US conceptually, but also the developed countries said, okay, there's already a bunch of funds. They don't really work. Why do we want to create a new fund? But in this way, this fund is different because it symbolically means that there may be more global solidarity on climate than ever before. Because the damages that we're going to be seeing the next 10 to 15 years are not comparable to what we've seen so far. So that's the hope. But then, okay, so now you're asking me nitty-gritty, so I have to go to our paragraphs. So we have our paragraphs, meaning the universal R. But aside from the new funding arrangements, the most exciting part of the decision is the paragraphs towards the end, because this is where we connect the UNFCCC to the larger flows. Here, we're asking the IFIs, the international financial institutions, to look at loss and damage and to help us out figure how we connect the small, tiny world of the UNFCCC into the larger financial landscape. So now we're waiting to hear what the spring meetings and what the World Bank and all of them are going to say to this decision. They've been awfully silent. So we have to poke them and ask, what are you going to do now that you've been asked for to help us out?
Thanks, Jimena. And so just in case this wasn't clear, the UNFCCC, it literally means the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But what we mean in this context is sometimes what's called the climate regime. So the sort of formal sort of set of institutions associated with climate change. And then the idea is that since loss and damage, especially when we look outwards, not just now, which is already big, but to the end of the decade, to the end of the century, we're talking about qualitative changes to the world, and hence nothing, no UN fund will ever be sufficient for this. Even if it was, imagine a world with massively better, contributions of developed countries to the UN, it still wouldn't be the kind of thing that we need. And hence this larger things imagined. So speaking of that, one of the things that's envisioned in this decision is greater cooperation in the whole UN system, and then in the whole related system. A lot of humanitarian and development comes not from the UN, but from NGOs, from bilateral arrangements. And so I wondered if, Azinta, sort of thinking from your role as a humanitarian officer, can you talk a little bit about how some of the rest of the UN system and other organizations are thinking about this, and how this coordination envisioned by the decision might happen? I know that's really hard because it hasn't happened yet, but maybe dream a little.
Yeah. So obviously it is tremendously exciting to dream together potentially about some of these things, but also a huge challenge. And just to give you an example of that challenge, the UN humanitarian system, we do already have funds that respond to some of the challenges and crises that I've mentioned. There's something called the Central Emergency Response Fund and the country-based pooled funds. And over the past decade, the Central Emergency Response Fund, for example, has spent 27% of its budget on climate-related or weather-related events. So we are there, we are already responding. But to give you an example of the needs for humanitarians alone, this year there's a call for $51 billion for humanitarian action. And right now in the climate system, you have about $20 billion, I believe you can correct me, going to adaptation per year. And we are trying to increase that by 2025 to double that. So, but look, if you think about that, that's only 40 billion. And we, in the humanitarian, that's to do with loss and damage. And that's only for really the life saving, not the cultural, so there's huge gaps in financing. And as you say, one fund alone is not going to fix this. So we're going to have to look at the IFIs, the World Bank, and look at the mechanisms that they can use to try to fill some of these gaps. How are we going to do that? That's a good question. I don't think there'll be some kind of overarching coordination mechanism coming from UNFCCC, but I think certainly by having decisions like this that call on the UN Secretary General to call together the heads of the IFIs to better kind of start having these conversations, we can increase awareness and look at how we can coordinate these tools. Now, practically going forward, you are going to have a transitional committee that's working on answering the question you posed, Michael. So I think we've got a year to figure out some answers to how do we fill these gaps? How do we better work together? So I won't preempt their work, but obviously OCHA does have some opinions, and I'm sure everybody here has opinions too. So I'd like to hear that from you guys as well.
Great. And pretty soon we'll be asking questions to the audience. So please do think of your questions and be ready. The microphone's over here, or if you're online, if you could drop them in the Q&A function. But and I do want to just echo what Zinta said, of course, especially the students. These are questions that there's no one person or even small groups of people that have all the necessary expertise. We need to draw on, enormous range of the intellectual landscape. So there's room for everyone in this, like many things in climate, room for everyone to make a really serious contribution. Before turning to the Q&A, I wanted to talk about the politics a little bit and maybe some kind of stories about what happened at COP. And maybe I'll start with Jimena. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the final days. And I think it's fair to say that there were many times where we almost did not have this decision and the whole COP would have been a failure. And there are pictures of me and Jimena sitting with looks on our faces that that we could show you later that suggests just this thing. I wondered if you could, say a little bit about that and just kind of what is the emotional landscape of a COP look like, and how did this one look?
Thank you so much. And I do agree. I think that the COP is an emotional roller coaster. Who in the audience has attended a COP? Can you raise your hand if you've been to COP? Just to have a sense of okay. Yeah. Okay. So COP is worse than planning a wedding, if I can say, in terms of the emotional distress. And the last hours are just as intense, I would think. I mean, in the sense that the emotions run high, because it's climate change has become such an emotional topic as well, with carrying a lot of anxiety, particularly for countries that feel that it's an existential threat to them. But even those that are not as vulnerable as SIDS, they are also getting drought, so it is a very emotionally driven context. But then you also have a lot of companies lobbying interests, like really big interests that are part of their delegations within the delegations itself. So there's really no separation sometimes between a country interest and a company interest. They're embedded in the process. So it's very complicated to who is really your counterpart that you're speaking across the table. Having said all that, I would say that the last hours of COP, we were like in a moment where we thought that the process had gone totally bad, because there were multiple texts. There were some errors by the presidency in terms of how to maintain an integrity of the process. And that was a bit ruptured. And it was only in the last hours that we felt that there was going to be at least a decision on loss and damage. Most of the times, the COP, the first thing that adopts is the cover decision, because that's the overarching kind of text, like the Glasgow Pact. But in this COP, the first thing that was adopted was the loss and damage. That just gives you how important this decision is. And then a few hours later, the cover decision was adopted. So I do think that the COP presidency had a very difficult time because of all these different interests that they had to try to manage as best as possible. And sometimes the process in itself kind of fell outside their hands. Luckily, towards the end, they were able to hold COP and to have an outcome. And now we're looking forward to the COP28, which is going to be in the United Arab Emirates, which already has several difficulties because the COP president is also the oil minister of the country.
So while you have the floor, Jimena, could you say something about, in this case, some real leadership was shown by some, of course, the small island states, as Stacey said, Prairie World House is all about the small island states, but I think in particular, Minister Shauna really, I just wondered if you could tell the audience a little bit about, a story about Minister Shauna and the leadership that she showed.
And today's her birthday. So Minister Shauna is the Minister of Environment of the Maldives. She is a young minister with a daughter that's 2 years old. And Haja, her deputy minister, state minister, is also another young woman from the South. These two women held their strength in front of many, many interests, and really were able to carry a lot of the tension in bringing this decision to life. They were able to mediate between the developing and the developed world, held bilaterals with Timmerman, the US, all of them. They really punch above their weight in that sense, but they were also able to bring the South with them. So it was with great admiration that we worked very closely with them, and we saw how under the fire of the press, under fire of their fellow peers, and under fire of their donors, they were able to really lead the way together with Pakistan as the G77 chair, with Antigua and Barbuda as AOC's chair. So there's always, in multilateralism, there's always a number of key leaders that amounts to less than 30 countries that really create the outcome. And the Maldives was certainly among that group of leaders that shaped the agreement.
So, Stacey, on kind of in this vein, you've worn many hats. You've been a negotiator. You're a professor. You've been, played major roles in civil society, advocating for these things. Can you talk about some of the roles beyond negotiators, the importance of civil society, of NGOs, of academia, of students in either this decision or kind of like-minded decisions? I think people here be quite interested in those roles.
Well, I think those roles are very important. And as we acknowledge the complexity of the climate challenge, I think increasingly we're going to realize just how important these roles are. At COP27, it was the first time that I was participating in a COP as an observer. So I think wearing this different hat, it really opened my eyes to things that I wouldn't have seen had I been a negotiator. So I think one of the things that was a little unsettling for me, sorry to start here, was observing the room and seeing how non-negotiators, so how observers enter the room, whether or not they could enter the room, whether they were barred from entering the room. When they came into the room, were there seats for them at the table? Did they have to sit on the floor? Who sits on the floor? Who sits at the table? Which one is more important, etc. So I really cued into these issues because I thought these are really issues of equity, right? And I've said this before, there's no equal participant that is going to be sat on the floor when others are at the table. So I think this is one of the issues that we need to focus on going forward. How can we engage these different constituents in a way that is empowering, in a way that acknowledges their contribution, the role that they play in the process, and just their importance going forward. So I think that's something that we need to pay attention to, because everybody has a role, but how can we elevate the role of others to match the importance that we place on the role of the negotiator?
Thanks so much. I'm going to ask Zinta a question, but the next question is coming from the audience. So there's a microphone here. Don't be embarrassed to ask the first question. Someone has to do it. Otherwise, it's going to be Tom. So Zinta, I guess I have a similar question. I mean, for you that so you're a scientist turned practitioner turned politician turned back to practitioner. I mean, what are, like, how does you work for the UN, so obviously you can't take sides on these issues, but you're also trying to help from the Secretariat. What does that look like? I mean, and you also, I forgot to mention among your hats is IPCC lead author. So, what are some of the other ways, and how can those that are kind of on the inside of this engage?
Yeah. So first of all, and thank you, you raised some really important points about the role of observers. And I will say that in this particular decision text that you're talking about, the loss and damage decision, yes, observers, the UN is an observer as well. We were often excluded from the room, but I will also note that member states commented on the importance of observers, and eventually they got us a bigger room so we could all sit and listen and observe and see the negotiations play out. So there's certainly a lot of politics around what type of rooms are given and who gets access, but I think there is an increasing recognition about that. It's important to have everybody there around the table and to not be sitting on the floor. And so that was certainly appreciated by the end. As observers, what do you do? Well, there's certainly some that sit and observe and take notes and feed it into the media, or you have these Earth negotiation bulletins. The scientists, the IPCC are often there, and often we're fielding questions from governments. So for example, we were engaged, or we know many of the negotiators. They would often come to us with questions about, what is the humanitarian community doing? How much money do you need? How could you support some of these decisions? And so I think it's really important to be there to help, inform the negotiators. And note that some of the negotiation teams come, they're hugely well-resourced, but others, particularly from small islands and from, developing countries, might come as one negotiator. The negotiations go all night. They don't have the support. And so it's often falls upon observers or others to kind of help be there to make those resources in terms of knowledge or facts available so that the negotiators can make the best decisions possible. And I think maybe to end on a positive note, or before we open up, but I will say that when you are at COP, I think a lot of the negotiators from all sides have been going many years to COP. There are friendships that extend. Well, it might seem, you mentioned it's quite adversarial, but you often, I love going because I get to meet colleagues from around the world, and some of them might be arguing for one thing and somebody might be sitting on the other table arguing against that. But in the end, I think everybody, and Jimena, you can correct me, but I would like to leave with the optimism that people there are, for the large part, trying to solve some of these problems. And they're just incredibly difficult problems to solve because the needs of, a community member in an IDP camp in South Sudan are just often very different from the needs of somebody, in the Philippines. And that's very different from the needs of somebody here in the US. And so finding a solution that fits all is incredibly challenging.
Thank you. And actually, in Jimena's wonderful book about negotiation, she said you should separate the flag from the person. So, and I'll also say, I often say to students, it's like, even on the mitigation side, it's easy to paint certain emerging economies as bad guys, but they're trying to lift people out of poverty, and it's not like they're burning coal just because they like to. I think these are very complex issues to think through. Okay, so the questions are open to the audience, and I have plenty more myself if the audience doesn't have questions, but I do see that if you'd like to ask a question, please come to the microphone, which is right there. And I see a question in the front, but you have to walk up to the microphone, and it is yours.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much for
Just maybe tilt it up a little bit more.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much for being here with us. My family hails from a small island, Mauritius, and so I really appreciate all of your work as scientists, academics, practitioners, and negotiators, and find it very inspiring. My question is about the role of different international financial institutions in helping fund the loss and damages provisions. And so I was curious, when you mentioned the IMF, if when you are thinking about a role in which the IMF would participate, if you think that there's a chance they'll participate in any kind of collective environmental governance and finance provisioning, or if it will be more similar to kind of something like Mia Motley from Barbados working directly with Christine Lagarde, the director of the IMF, and if each developing country is going to have to fight one-on-one for that kind of relationship or financial help. And I'm also curious if you notice anything about the role of philanthropists at COP. I noticed that you mentioned the role of different private sector actors, and I was curious if philanthropists are also potentially going to be involved in some of these one-on-one relationships with saving specific things like the Congo Basin. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks so much. Great questions. Maybe Jimena, you can start because I know you've been thinking a lot about IMF.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And Mauritius, I hear it's beautiful. Yeah. So on the IFIs, on the international financial institutions, yes, we spend a lot of time trying to connect the UNFCCC machinery with the IFI. So now there is a direct ask or call for the IFIs to engage on loss and damage. That's the first time that this happens. So now there's a window of opportunity for the IFIs to really think about their engagement here. And Mia Motley, which you mentioned, through the Bridgetown Agenda, is kind of the leading voice that is opening that door through SDRs. And we do have an amazing paper on loss and damage written by Michael Franczak, who delves into the question of loss and damage finance. And in that paper, we go into detail on some of the financing mechanisms and the roles of the World Bank and the IMF. And so we do expect them to come up with additional measures connected to the Bridgetown Agenda, but even perhaps more broader to include other least developed countries and another set of countries. And on philanthropies, we work very closely with philanthropists. And I think they're also an early comer into the loss and damage finance. They are providing small seed funding on loss and damage that is helping open the door for others to come in. So I think the world is coming to loss and damage slowly. Yeah,
And
thank
if you, another thing just to mention, if you look at the text, there's a general, beyond the specific callouts, there's a generic term, innovative finance. And I think it's meant to include all of these things, sovereign wealth, things like philanthropy, sovereign wealth funds, tariffs of various sorts. So this paper that Heyman is mentioning, which we can circulate to the list afterwards, if not put in the chat, was written by Michael Franzek at the International Peace Institute, who incidentally was a postdoc at Prairie World House before taking that post. Stacy, did you want to add anything to that, or Zinta? Or we could take the next question. Or
Just to say
Zinta.
that some of the philanthropies, the Gates Foundation, for example, have traditionally been very active in making announcements. For example, the last climate summit, often outside of UNFCCC framework, but in the kind of build up around. And there are others that I know are actively looking now at how best to invest in this space. So there's increasingly investment in this.
Great. Good. Or do
Yeah, I think one of the key takeaways here is that we need all hands on deck. So it's not just the IMF, it's not just the World Bank. We need all the IFIs and also to mobilize other sources of income, because I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we have too much money. So we need to work on that. But an interesting point that I thought you made was this idea of, the Barbadian prime minister going, to the IMF directly. And it made me think about, the future of multilateralism in this context. And it also made me think about something that Zinta mentioned. And I thought about the history of AOSIS. And it's the fact that small islands didn't have the capacity in the COPs, why they needed to work together. So I think there is a lesson there. Somebody needs to go out first, right? But we also need the support behind that person that includes the multilateral infrastructure to sort of get the gains that Prime Minister Motley has been able to get. And one thing that I really like about her approach is it's fearless. It's something, she's asking for something that has never been done before. And my question is always, why not? Just ask.
And if you're interested, for those of you that don't know much about Prime Minister Motley, I highly recommend you watch her address to the General Assembly in September. It's just amazing. And you say, this is a world leader. Like it's really something special. Yes, next question.
Awesome. Thanks so much. My name is Ayo. I'm a graduate student studying public policy, and I'm also a graduate associate here at Prairie World House. So thank you all for being here. My question kind of revolves around this topic of informal and formal mechanisms of good governance, especially in a setting like a COP conference. So you all mentioned small island nations needing to sort of stick together, maybe in a formal way to ask for what they need and get what they want. And then you also mentioned that it's hard to separate the interests of multinational corporations and entire countries, which seems not good to me. So my question is, in these, and you also mentioned too, like in a literal sense, coming to a table and people having to decide who's sitting at the table and who's sitting on the floor and who has more power and who doesn't. So my question is kind of like, in a setting like this, what are the opportunities or needed mechanisms for promoting just better governance, or like good governance, good shared decision making, in order to, for example, like separate out the interests of public and private institutions, or to allow small nations or small countries to consolidate their interests or come together in a formalized way. But curious about what those mechanisms can look like. Thank you.
Maybe I can just start by just putting one kind of framework comment on the table and then turn to you guys, which is that, we dove right in, didn't give a lot of kind of preliminaries about the structure of COP, but just so formally speaking, the parties referred to in Conference of the Parties are countries. So some of the question of being at the table or not is really, parties, meaning countries versus observers. Now, Jimena was referring to the fact that some countries have a lot of, like the government and some of their national corporations are a little blended. And some of the countries that produce a lot of, oil, let's say, blend those things. Much less true, I think, in a country like the United States, who would have a much more formal civil service. Not to say there's not a lot of influence, but just to say that the just to begin with, though, there's a lot of people at COP. I mean, 36,000 of them or so are not members of national delegations, and then the people that are formally negotiating are these delegates from countries. And one of the things that's really interesting in this question, which I'm giving the panel a little time to think about, is like, what are ways, both to make it more equitable for those people, so that small island states versus the big guys have a voice, which I personally think that UNFCCC does better than most forums. And then also, let's say you went and you were a member of civil society. How would you be able to have a meaningful voice here when 40,000 people are there? So I think these are really interesting questions of governance at many, many levels. So who'd like to jump into that? Zinta.
I'll just give an example of, in a previous role, how we've addressed some of this. And for example, I mentioned how civil society can play an active role. We've worked with some of like the LDCs, for example. Often their negotiators they don't come with huge teams of support. They might be younger and they haven't had as many years of training in how to do negotiation. So for example, they came to, at the time I was working with, this is again without the UN, but a consortium of NGOs that I was working with, including Mercy Corps and the IFRC. And they wanted support just to organize a pre-meeting before COP, to have a space where they could gather together themselves, and then also potentially with AOSIS to figure out what they even wanted to advocate for in relation to loss and damage. And so it can be as simple as trying to make sure that somebody can rent a room in a hotel or in some space near the venue where they can gather a day or two beforehand and discuss their strategy. And that's one way to kind of level the playing field for some of these parties. But others might have more concrete examples.
That's it. A minute.
Sure. So I was thinking, you said that the audience likes stories. So I can tell you a story on how we built a special coalition. This was in South Africa, 2011. And it was towards the end of the COP, and we realized that the big guys, meaning the big countries, the emerging economies, and basically the P5 translated into climate, the basics, the US, they fit in a dining table, right? We realized that the big gorillas in the process had met, and they had decided for all of us that the negotiations for the legally binding treaty, which is now the Paris Agreement, were going to start in 2015 and end in 2020. This was 2011. And all of us went nuts. All of us, meaning all the small countries in the world. So I was part of the Guatemalan mission there. And so Guatemala came together. I founded ILAC, the Progressive Alliance of Latin American Countries. We came together with AOSIS. We came together with the LDCs. So basically like the 150 countries in the world. And we said, there's absolutely no way that you are going to decide that the Paris Agreement is going to start the negotiations in 2015. That would mean we would not have a Paris Agreement today, because by 2016, the political geometry completely changed. We did not, Obama, we didn't have him afterwards. We needed to adopt the Paris Agreement in 2015. And if in 2011, we wouldn't have had that coalition of all the small countries in the world, we would not have the Paris Agreement now. So there are moments in history where we are able to coalesce as the developing world. And there are moments in which we've been able to stop the interests of corporations and of big countries to meddle with the big idealism that these negotiations need. But the UNFCCC process is very permeable. So sometimes it becomes very hard to separate the interest from the ideal. And that's basically why we work so hard right now in identify the pure leaders that have those really good interests and heart, and then we just help them push forward.
If you don't mind, Stacey, I'll just go to the next question. Yeah, please.
You mentioned that when an earthen dike fails, there can be substantial loss of life and also substantial economic losses, presumably. In terms of having silos between essentially mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damages, how would you assess whether it's more efficient in terms of saving lives and also in terms of general economic prosperity to, for example, invest in better infrastructure to prevent a loss or compensating for the losses and damage as best you can after the fact versus, trying to reduce CO2 in the hopes that, in 50 years from now, it'll be less flooding, or things along those lines.
Thanks so much. Great question. Do you want to start, Zinta, and then Stacey?
Sure. I'll just start with so in my other hat, I work with as an author on the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. And we'll have for those of you interested in this, there'll be a synthesis report. It's going to be released in about a month, middle of March. So keep your eyes open for that. But one of the key findings from the recent cycle of IPCC reports is that, obviously, yes, as governments, as individuals, we have to choose. We have limited funding. How do we choose where to allocate it? But the science is increasingly indicating that kind of assuming that we can wait and maybe either adapt our way out and or deal with the losses and damages, that isn't economically viable, simply because as the temperatures increase, our adaptation options become more limited, less effective, and more expensive. So for example, we know that many of the activities, for example, related to agriculture and potentially changing types of crops or irrigation, they work now as a form of adaptation. And maybe that's kind of giving people drought-resistant seeds as a low-cost solution to a forthcoming drought. But if we keep having to do it repeatedly, and if the droughts become more and more and more intense, we actually, the adaptation science right now doesn't have we don't know if it will still be effective at 3 degrees of global warming, and most likely won't be effective. So the scary thing is that our solution space is shrinking as we delay mitigation. So I think the conclusion from the scientists is it's much cheaper to act now than to wait and to try to either compensate or to try to adapt to a rapidly changing world.
Thanks so much, Zinta. Stacey Ann, I know you have many thoughts on this.
I also had many thoughts on the last question.
Well, please, you can just combine them. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm
just looking at that clock that says we don't have much time. So.
Sure. I don't know where to start. I wanted to go back to this issue of governance, right? And Michael, you mentioned that in the UNFCCC, it seems to do a little bit better than, some of the other venues. And I agree with that 100%. But from my perspective, it's because the UNFCCC is consensus-based, right? And this is why in the IFIs, for example, where decisions are made by voting, we have issues, right? But there is this need to everybody come together, let's make a decision. But the issue of governance is very important. And I want to connect it back to finance, because when we look at the flows of adaptation finance, we see where good governance quality is rewarded in the decision. And I think this is gonna come up when it comes to loss and damage finance as well, the extent to which we're willing to reward good governance. So then I made a conceptual link to the question that was just asked, and how do we decide? And I think what Zinta was mentioning, in my mind, it sounded like, the efficiency. So the economic argument is really, is it an efficient way to use the funds based on whether it's life saved or income saved, etc. But then I was thinking, what about vulnerability? Are we going to say the vulnerability of this location or this population requires us to respond in this way because of that reason? So it becomes a question for me, what are we willing to preference? Is it efficiency? Is it vulnerability? And of these two, should either of them be the criterion for allocating loss and damage finance? Or do we need to do away with how we've normally thought of these allocation decisions, and we need new criteria because what we're faced with is so exponentially great that we need to shake up the system and do something transformational? So my thought process.
Just to give you a sense of just seriously how, like, these are the questions that actually the next year's worth of negotiation needs to actually begin grappling with. So that's why, I mean, it's not like with mitigation, the answer is clear what we need to do, and then there's politics. Here, there's politics and the answer is not clear. And it's got these normative dimensions along with the empirical one, along with a lot of uncertainty. So I think, you know, one of the reasons why Perry Woodhouse focuses so much on this issue, because it's so complex. We have another question.
Thank you. This has been a great panel. I wanted to ask if perhaps you could share any insights or views regarding the roles of cities in this context. Thank you.
Who'd like to start? Cities. It falls on me. I don't know. I just listen. I mean, one thing that we can say is that so I can speak a little generally about this. That you know, that this is so one of the, if you look at some of the highlights of climate policy at Penn, the city issues is a big part of it. And in fact, you know, Perry Woodhouse has a big group, a big dimension of global cities. In fact, in an upcoming conference on extreme heat, we'll have the chief heat officers from, I think, 7 cities in the world here. So loss and damage, you know, is a lot of the actual on the ground policy is being experimented with and implemented at the city level. For the UNFCCC, one of the struggles is that it is a conference of the parties, meaning national governments. And so among, you know, cities are observers unless say the mayors are part of national delegations. So cities don't formally have a seat in the negotiations. And you know, one of the most interesting things in climate policy has been that cities have often led, especially when the cities are often more progressive than the countries that they're in, and hence mayors are often more progressive than the national leaders. So I think, you know, I actually don't know myself what exactly if cities have had you know, some cities have contributed loss and damage funding. But I think most of it's really like the implementation of actions to avert, minimize, address loss and damage are maybe happening in cities. I don't know if that sparks any thoughts in our panel, but we have another minute if it does. No, not so many cities in Jamaica. Is that Stacey has worked in many towns, I'd say, but
Yeah,
if we can call towns cities.
two cities in Jamaica, but you know, my caveat here is I don't work at the subnational level. Like all my work is national scale, regional scale, international scale. So I don't want to, you know, jump too far outside my comfort zone. But I could say that in some instances, it seems that, you know, networks of cities are really coming together, especially, you know, during the Trump presidency, when you know, things look like they're going up in smoke, you know. they really were able to mobilize, and I think some networks have created like parallel structures almost that are now in, you know, this post-Paris era, if you can say that, are really complementary. So again, you know, an earlier point that I made was that, you know, we need all hands on deck. I'm a very firm believer in the multilateral process. I believe it works. It just takes time, but this shouldn't be the only process. Earlier, Michael mentioned, you know, the climate regime. You know, some of the political scientists will talk about the climate change regime complex. And within that, the UNFCCC is only one dot, but, you know, you need to bring in the IFIs, for example, the bilateral organizations, the city networks, etc. So there's a role for everybody, and especially youth, right? So you have an opportunity, us as young people, us as young people can really make a difference in the space, but there are many different channels and we need to tap into all of them.
So I'm sorry to say that we have to stop here, but I think you see that we're just scratching the surface on this incredibly complex and rich topic. You'll see a lot more of this around Perry Woodhouse if you are so interested. So thank you so much to our wonderful, distinguished panel. Let's give them all a big round of applause. But also thank you very much to our online and in-person audience for your participation today. Let me just tell you about 2 upcoming events on February 7th. We'll welcome back our yearly event with the U.S. Army War College. The title of that event is The Future of the Indo-Pacific, Insights from the U.S. and Australian Militaries. And then the following week on a Wednesday, unusual, but on February 15th, we'll have a discussion about the recent unrest in Brazil featuring a PhD student from the Federal University of Rio and a professor of history and African-American studies at Duke University, moderated by Michael Henchard, who is our own professor at Penn and a member of Africana Studies and a member of the Perry World-House Faculty Council. So thank you very much. You'll see those events here, I hope, or live streamed. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on the Perry World-House YouTube channel. You can find out about all of our other great events we have planned by going to our website or joining the mailing list, which everybody online is automatically joined. And if you in the room would also like to join, you can as well. We'll drop links to all of these events in the chat. For those of us joining in person, the student lounge has a snack afterwards. And thank you so much to all of you for being here today. See you soon.
Thank you, Michael.